And welcome to the Rally Point with Dominic Fielder, the author of the King's German series, and myself, Rob McLaren, the author of the Joubert series. Dominic Fielder is not with us today. He's just on the back end of a bout of COVID and is having a little lie-in. We wish you to get well soon there, Dominic. Now, each month at the Rally Point, we catch up with friends who enjoy the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period. Now, everyone, we're recording the first 30 minutes of the gathering, but once the recording is over, we remain online and the conversation continues. This month, we'd like to welcome William Clark to the Rally Point. William is a French Revolutionary specialist and a history podcaster. William's currently, at this moment, based in Britain. His show, Grey History, has now been on online for 5 years, to such a point that such success that William's now enjoying it and conducting it full time. Tonight, William's promised us a deep dive into the Federalist revolts, which ended at the siege of Toulon. And of course, for those who are following Napoleon, this is obviously the beginning of young Bonaparte's stellar career when the gentleman himself was around 23 to 24 years old. Welcome, William. Welcome. How are you?
I'm great, thank you, Rob. How are you?
I'm terrific. I'm terrific. Here we are with friends all over the world and having a fascinating chat. William, you're got a presentation for us. You can bring it up on screen, and I'll just hand straight over to you, my friend.
Perfect. So just to kind of, I suppose, maybe reintroduce myself briefly. My name's Will Clark, and I'm the host of Grey History, the French Revolution, which is a long-form kind of deep dive podcast series on the French Rev. Truth be told, it probably could be called the French Revolution podcast, but it's called Grey History because I really think that when we take the time to explore the past, we should acknowledge that history isn't black and white. There's ambiguity, there's nuance, and I think that in order to get the most out of history, not only its intrigue and its beauty, but most importantly, its lessons, we do need to take the time to look at that ambiguity and unpack it further. So the show has just finished 11 episodes on the Federalist revolts. And for me, the Federalist revolts are this amazing period of time in the French Revolution that often gets shortchanged. This is, I think, a perfect opportunity to step back from Paris and have a look at the French Revolution. Too often, I think the French Revolution is boiled down to a little bit of an excessive focus on the capital. Obviously, Paris is very important, but what's happening elsewhere is really interesting. I think it's fascinating, and it helps to challenge some of the norms and the expectations that we see in Paris, where some cities and some communities deviate quite significantly from the capital. As I said, I've just done 11 episodes on the Federalist Revolt, so obviously I'm not going to cover that all here tonight. But what I wanted to do was maybe just give a quick, brief overview of the Federalist Revolts and point out some of the interesting things that I found as we went and did these deep dives in the various rebel centers across the country. So if I think about the Federalist Revolts, quite often in books on the French Revolution and the like, at times they only get a few pages. And the traditional narrative that we kind of see is this idea, obviously we get the first insurrection on the 31st of May with ultra-radicals and some Jacobins in Paris, essentially trying to purge the Girondin deputies. They succeed on the 2nd of June. We then generally, in a kind of traditional narrative of the events, we keep this Paris-centric narrative. We see the Constitution in late June, the assassination of Marat in mid-July. And then by the end of the year, the major centers of rebellion are defeated, most notably Lyon in October and Toulon in December. And obviously there we see Napoleon's first great triumph. What I wanted to do is, expand upon this kind of narrative a little further by looking at the beginnings, the development, the program, and then the demise of the Federalist revolts. So if I start with the beginning, the insurrections of 31 May and 2 June are obviously critical. They're often portrayed as the key catalyst for the Federalist revolts, and in many ways they are. Depending on the contemporary sources that you're looking at, these events can be portrayed incredibly differently. So what we know as a fact is that thousands, tens of thousands, once you include the crowds of Parisians, surround the convention on the 2nd of June, and there is a threat of force by insurrectionary National Guardsmen if the Girondins aren't purged. The way that this is portrayed changes dramatically depending on your sources. So sometimes this is portrayed as a people's coup, a popular insurrection. Sorry, I think the dogs are going to go barking. There's a very bark-happy golden retriever below me, so
all good.
apologies if that's coming through. The Federalist revolt's perfect. The Federalist revolt sometimes, as I said, portrayed as this quite positive event. You can see here a rather jovial idea of the deputies embracing and interacting with the crowd. The other way to portray this is something that emphasizes the threat of violence that was seen outside. So we have these competing narratives. But these dates, the 2nd of June, in particular, the purging by the time you include the deputies and the ministers, just over 30 individuals, is the key catalyst for the Federalist revolts. And you can see here in the dark blue, or the darker shade here, the areas of France that are particularly impacted by the revolt. And you can see the Vendée in purple. That insurrection is separate and is already ongoing by the time of mid-1793. The key centers of rebellion that we're really interested in are scattered across the country. So in the north, you have Caen up in Normandy. In the southwest, Bordeaux on the Atlantic coast. And then to the east of the country, you have Lyon near Switzerland, which is the second largest city of France, and then Marseille and Toulon. One of the things that I found really interesting getting into the detail here is that actually, while the purging of the Girondins is, a key impetus for insurrection against the capital, the unrest in the departments is actually very extensive even before the purging of the Girondins. So if you look at a timeline of what's happening here, there is essentially a slow burn anti-Jacobin municipal revolution in Marseille for the entirety of the month of May. Now, Marseille at this point in time, its population is maybe just under 110,000. So it's much smaller than Paris, which might be somewhere closer to the 700,000 mark, but it's still the 3rd/4th largest city in France. Bordeaux and Marseille are very similar populations at this point in time. In addition to Marseille experiencing this anti-Jacobin municipal revolution prior to the purging of the Girondins, Lyon also has its own anti-Jacobin municipal revolution in late May. So again, prior to the purging of the Girondins. That revolution is actually bloody. As per all things in the French Revolution, people dispute how bloody, but Marseille's revolution is relatively peaceful in comparison. And in addition to that, up in Normandy, up in Caen, again, prior to the purging of the Girondins, they're starting to assemble a departmental armed force with the intention to march on the capital if the factional politics, or what it sees to be as the factional politics of the capital, continues to paralyze the revolution. So what I'm calling out here is that even though we generally think of the Federalist revolts being triggered by the purging of the Girondins, and that is indeed the primary catalyst, significant insurrection is gripping the country in the major population centers prior to that event. And that's, of course, in addition to the fact that the Vendée is engrossed in a royalist civil war. Interestingly, another little fact that I thought was really interesting, at the time of the start of the Federalist revolts, Toulon is a bit of the odd duck out. And that's because Toulon is actually under a Jacobin municipality and continues to be so for more than a month. It's actually today, the 13th of July, Bastille Day Eve, that Toulon goes through its own municipal revolution and sees an anti-Jacobin, insurrectionary authorities come to power. At that point in time, still Republican orientated, not yet declared royalists. So what I find interesting is perhaps the most famous of the insurrectionary centers being Toulon, due to its ties with Napoleon, is actually in many ways a late bloomer and is actually under Jacobin control at the time that these insurrections break out. So if I then think about the development, how do these insurrections develop over time? This here is a map of how the departments of France respond to the purging of the Girondins. Now, I appreciate that you might not have be able to see on that screen the utter details, so I'll just read the kind of legend for you. Those departments in dark blue declare in favor of the Jacobin Convention. Those departments in yellow protest the purging of the Girondins, but don't engage in significant armed resistance. And then those departments in green do engage in significant armed resistance. And if you look at this, you can start to see some quite interesting geographic patterns. Those regions that are quite close to Paris, in the center of the nation, generally back the convention, as well as, in particular, those departments along the northeastern border. At this point in time, the Austria has reclaimed modern-day Belgium after a counter-offensive that started in March 1793. The Prussians are on the move in the Rhineland. So those departments that are literally facing foreign invasion very much aren't so interested in intra-republican squabbles, if you like. They don't really care about the Jacobin-Girondin divide as much when the Prussians are knocking on their doorstep. Another aspect you also see that kind of inversed down in the south near the Spanish border, where you have a similar dynamic. Those departments that need national support just want to move on with the problem that's immediately facing them. Also interesting, I find here, if you look where the Vendée Rebellion is in red, those departments that are kind of facing the royalist insurrection, at the coalface, so to speak, they too, while they might protest the Girondin prescription, ultimately fall in line. They want the support of the national government and national troops. What I think it really kind of comes home from this map, if you're thinking about the Federalist centers, is just how isolated they are from each other. You've got some rebel centers up in the north and northwest of the country, in Normandy and Brittany, but the Vendée is separating them from linking up with Bordeaux in the southwest. And likewise, there is a big stretch between Bordeaux in the southwest and Marseille and Toulon and Lyon over in the east. And this is a big factor that hampers the development of the Federalist revolts. If I then look at the program of the Federalist revolts, I mean, they're called the Federalist revolts. So I think it's worth discussing briefly just how Federalist these revolts are. And to do that, the term federalism means so many different things to so many different people within the context of the French Revolution, and even more so once you bring it out of the French Revolution. So I thought I'd do a quick explainer of what federalism means in the context of France in 1793, and just why, to quote historian Robert Palmer, this becomes the supreme form of heresy in the young French Republic. So if you think a federation from a textbook perspective is a political entity which consists of a union of smaller, partially self-governing entities. Now, I know that that is a very textbook explanation, but that's okay, because we're going to put that behind us. I want you to imagine 4 colonies. You can think of them as 13 colonies for no particular reason. I just couldn't be bothered putting 13 yellow dots on my screen. So we're going to call them the 4 colonies. And if these independent and free states wanted to form a federation in the same way that the 13 colonies had to do in the late 18th century, essentially what they need to do is they need to voluntarily shrink their own power and then invest that power in a new federal government. And generally what you see happening in federalism is they will then codify that relationship with a written constitution so that things can't be unilaterally changed. And that is essentially what occurred over in America, where the states voluntarily gave some of their power to a new federal government. And that is why, in the context of American history, even at the same time as the French Revolution is ongoing, when Americans talk about federalism, they're talking about centralization. They're talking about increasing power to the federal government. They're, more tangible policies like creating a national bank, a strong executive president, but this is very much a process of centralizing power in the new federal government. But France was not a federation at this point in time. It was a unitary state, which, from a textbook perspective, is when a sovereign state is governed by a single entity which has supreme authority. So if you think about the situation that France found itself in 1793, in the first year of the Republic, if France wanted to become a federation, which we'll come to in a second if it did or did not, but if the Federalist rebels wanted France to become a federation, then the process that they would need to do would actually be a process of decentralization. So they would need to create smaller, partially self-governing entities. They would need to empower those entities. They would need to restrict the power of the new federal government and then codify that relationship. So across the Atlantic in America, when we talk about federalism, it's about centralizing power. But in the context of the French Revolution, it means the exact opposite. If you were going to implement federalism in France, it would be about decentralizing power from Paris to the departments or some other administrative unit. And the question that I think most people ask is, well, what's wrong with federalism? I mean, many people on this call come from a federalist or a country that is a federalist nation. The Australians, the Americans, the Germans. That federalism is not something that many of us live with day to day. And not only that, but if you think about the French Revolution, federalism was once celebrated. If you think about the municipal revolutions that occur after the storming of the Bastille and in response to the Great Fear, where we see across the nation of France, locals, essentially local elites and bourgeois, etc., take over the local administration of municipalities and like, that is essentially a federalist act. It is not waiting for orders from Paris. It is decentralizing much of what was a quite centralist state in the old regime. Likewise, the creation of national guards and the festivals of federation that we see held in the first year of the revolution is, again, celebrating this idea of federalism. And the first anniversary of the storming of the Bastille is actually called the Festival of the Federation. Perhaps most famously, in the overthrow of the monarchy on the 10th of August, 1792, some of the key players there are fédérés from Marseille, as well as other parts of France. So again, we see associations of this idea of federation, which then begs the question, well, why is it that federalism becomes this catch-all word to describe the most sinister intentions and this most terrible insult in Republican France? And the answer is that from the perspective of the Jacobins, there's many reasons why they distrusted federalism. But first and foremost, it was this idea that you were fracturing the one and indivisible republic. And especially in 1793, you have civil war in the Vendée, you have foreign war on multiple fronts, the Spanish, the English, the Prussians, the Austrians, the Piedmont Sardinians. This idea that if you're dividing the one and indivisible republic, disunity is death. And it's viewed as this policy, this kind of decentralization is viewed as this policy that is deadly to the young republic. In addition to that, you have some ideological concerns. If you think about, from the perspective of many Jacobins, what they worried about with federalism is that local governments and local regimes would override the will of the people, the will of the sovereign nation. And at best, this might be misguided, but at worst, it could be corruption or something more sinister. And that was another aspect of why many Jacobins distrusted federalism, is that they saw this as a way for local elites to perhaps enrich themselves and others and develop their own little power bases, which were against the interests of the nation as a whole, if you like. So this is a rather long paragraph, but don't worry, I'll read it myself. But as we go through this, I just want you to keep in mind what I was just saying about why federalism was so distrusted by the Jacobins in Paris, despite the fact that just a couple years before, federation was being actively celebrated, as were the so-called Federé National Guards units. So this is a quote from historian Alan Forrest, and he states, if taken literally, federalism implied a desire to break away from the center, to put local or regional interests above those of the nation, even to withdraw that part of national sovereignty which the people of each city or department had invested in the National Assembly. It was primarily used as a term of abuse, its most salient quality being a willingness to sacrifice national unity for selfish gain, and to risk breaking up the political integrity of France in pursuit of sectional advantage. And he goes on to say that it is considered the gravest of political crimes. So what I find particularly interesting about the Federalist revolts is that you have this idea of federalism that the Americans are championing as a solution to good government, that in France initially is seen relatively positively in the first few years of the era of the constitutional monarchy. But by mid-1793, with not even a year into the young republic, it is seen as, as historian Alan Forrest says, this gravest of political crimes. But that then begs the question of, was the Federalist revolts even Federalist? Did they actually aspire to create some sort of Federalist system? And historians are quite divided here, but many, including those from quite different ideological camps, would argue no. And in fact, historian Michael Sydenham has a great line that he actually thinks that these revolts should be called the Republican revolts, because he would argue that there wasn't really a Federalist program in these so-called Federalist revolts. And if you go look at primary sources, you go look at the manifestos, the declarations of these various rebel centers, they bend over backwards to argue that they are not endangering the one and indivisible republic. They bend over backwards to refute federalism. The most solid example we see of like a broad, well thought out manifesto actually comes from Normandy up in Caen, and it's the collective work of 9 rebel departments. And if you go read all 25 points, as I have, there is not an ounce of federalism in it, in my own personal opinion. In saying that, obviously, the Jacobins argued that these were Federalist revolts. And as I said earlier, it becomes this kind of catch-all insult for enemies of the Jacobin Convention. I would point out, though, that some historians do make the case that we should consider the Federalist revolts Federalist. Some argue that there were, in elements, plans of secession of various regions. As you can see there in the yellow, historian Eric Hazen, who is kind of like a neo-Marxist historian. He is someone who has no time for the Girondins at all. But in this instance, even though being quite pro-Jacobin, he argues that the Federalist revolts were not Federalist. There are some historians that do point to secession or to the very fact that these rebellions are occurring in the first place and are doing so often in the name of being the will of the people, but the people being the department or the municipality. They argue that that inherent act is federalism. So this is quite murky, but what I wanted to tease out here was this idea that actually with federalism, you have something that's celebrated in the first years of the revolution. It then becomes this most terrible insult, as historian Robert Palmer says, the supreme heresy of the Republic. And what you have here is a bunch of historians from a range of ideological backgrounds that fiercely disagree over whether we should think of them as Federalist or not. And as I said, historian Michael Sydenham makes the case that we should think of these as the Republican revolts, because by and large, they are Republican. Even in Toulon, where essentially it is Vice Admiral Hood that requires a declaration in favor of the monarchy in return for taking custody of Toulon in late August. So it's fascinating to see that kind of disconnect between how we think of them in the terms of their name and then the situation that's on the ground. So that's the program. What about the demise? Where does it all go wrong for the Federalist revolts? And you could spend a lot of time getting into this, and each revolt is different, and the specific circumstances of Lyon is different from Toulon, which is different from Caen, for example. But there are four things that I would note. The first is the Constitution of 1791. And, historian Albert Matee describes this as an instrument of pacification. And that's what it is. It is an instrument of pacification for many reasons. But in short, the first thing that the Constitution of 1791 does, I should say that the Girondins are purged on the 2nd of June. The Constitution of 1791 is presented by essentially a Jacobin subset of the Committee of Public Safety 8 days later, on the 10th of June. It is then adopted by the convention on the 24th of June, so 2 weeks later. So you have essentially just over 3 weeks between the purging of the Girondins and the adoption of the Constitution. So the Montagnard Convention turns this around very fast. And the reason why they're doing so is because of the impact that it has and what I'm about to discuss. The first thing it does is it adds legitimacy and authority to the convention. You may recall that image that I showed earlier where a significant number of departments were in yellow because they protested the purging of the Girondins. By some accounts, it is up to 60 departments. There were only just over 80 at the time. And so what the Constitution does is it adds legitimacy and authority to what is in many ways a rump parliament in some regards. It also undermines accusations of Jacobin tyranny. The Jacobins can quite rightly point out, well, our Girondin opponents accuse us of aspiring towards tyranny or creating anarchy in the capital, but actually, once they have left the convention, the fabled Constitution arrives within just weeks. And so it undermines these accusations that they're aspiring for some sort of Jacobin dictatorship, because what dictators would bring about a democratic constitution. In fact, a constitution that some historians consider to be the first democratic constitution. And likewise, it allows the Jacobins to paint the Girondins as the true obstructionists. And finally, and a particular dynamic and an ironic dynamic, is that the Constitution provides a means for would-be rebels to choose ballots over bullets. It provides a means to avoid civil war. Some of these departments that are not quite sure if they want to declare in favor of a rebellion or not, they essentially make the conclusion that a march on Paris, armed insurrection, is probably doomed to fail. But many of the departments, 60 of 80 odd departments had protested the purge of the Girondins. Many of these departments could quite possibly vote for anti-Jacobin deputies in elections which surely must follow the Constitution's adoption. So some of these departments decide to back down or back away from formal insurrection and vote to adopt the Constitution. And essentially, they are seeking to change the government in Paris through ballots rather than bullets. The irony here is there, of course, that the Constitution of 1793 is never implemented. It is argued by the Jacobins that it is just unfeasible or even dangerous to implement the democratic constitution in the time of war and national struggle. And so the irony here is that these would-be rebels that make this calculation never get the chance. The next big factor that I think is worth just nudging on the demise is the assassination of Marat, which occurred today. So this is the anniversary of the death of Marat. Not a single event historian Timothy Tackett, who's a fantastic historian and has written extensively on the terror, he argues that no more single event more envenomed attitudes towards the Federalist rebels. Essentially, it convinces the Jacobins that this is a kill or be killed situation. The rebels do not warrant mercy. The Girondins are hypocrites because they've been denouncing the Jacobins as would-be assassins, and yet the Girondins are the ones assassinating their political opponents. And we see this play out in a great case in Lyon. Insurrection Lyon actually accepts the Constitution. It decides to acknowledge the purging of the Girondins, but they're still not able to find some sort of settled agreement with the Jacobin Convention. And the embitterment and attitudes by Marat's assassination is part of that. And so ultimately we get just more than a 2-month siege of Lyon, and then quite an infamous set of reprisals afterwards. Next factor to point out is counter-revolution, in particular what's occurring in the Vendée. The Vendée is preventing Brittany and Normandy from linking up with Bordeaux, and it's actually forcing departments that had protested and had declared in favor of insurrection to back down. In June 1793, the Vendéan rebels are on achieving several wins. They take Saumur, amongst other places, and essentially there are departments that were going to be involved in the insurrection that back out. And you can see in the smaller circle there, the Department of Orne. That is a department that is very quick out of the gates, that it is going to summon a local departmental guard unit and march on Paris. And yet as the Vendée insurrection grows and grows, they will back out. They will withdraw their delegates from the central kind of insurrectionary committee that the northern departments had created, and they essentially fall in line and declare in favor of the constitution and the convention, and then kindly ask for military support to deal with the rebels. The last point to note is a topic of great debate amongst historians, and it relates to popular support. I mean, how popular are these Federalist revolts? All of them claim a mantle of popular support. If you look at the insurrectionary committees and the like, many of them use the word popular in their titles. The fact of the matter is that it was extraordinarily difficult for these regions to raise troops that would actually march on Paris. And their inability to exert power outside of the immediate proximity around them was a key issue for the failings of these revolts, in addition to the fact that they were geographically quite spread out and quite often had hostile territory in between them. So that was a quick overview of the Federalist revolts. Hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of some of the debates between historians and scholars about the Federalist rebellions and just how Federalist they were. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. And if you're interested in the Federalist revolts or even just the siege of Toulon, you know, we're all Napoleonic enthusiasts here. I do encourage you to check out the most recent episodes on these rebellions. You're not going to have to go all the way back to episode 1 if you would just like to enjoy a deep dive into Lyon or Marseille or Toulon, etc. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Rob.
William, thank you. That was a brilliant insight and you've obviously taken a vast amount of knowledge and packed it into a tiny amount of time for us, and we all appreciate that. Thank you. And I have a question. One of the link-ups that was achieved was that between Marseille and Avignon. A quick response there on what was Marseille and Avignon able to achieve with that link-up. What were the short-term successes there, where other departments hadn't been able to achieve that?
Lyon's up here, and then Marseille down here, and you can actually see Avignon where that fire is in the center there. And what, as you say, I suppose the big picture here is that Lyon is the second largest city of France. It's about a population of about 150,000 people. Marseille, roughly the third largest at just under 110,000. If Lyon and Marseille can link up, that is, in theory, a much stronger base of rebellion against the capital. And then proximity-wise, they're not too far. And I suppose it is worth pointing out that these rebellions are kind of feeding off each other. They hear about what the other is doing, and that encourages them to go a little bit further and put their local Jacobins on trial and all the rest of it. But if we think about Marseille and what Marseille's up to here, as I mentioned in the presentation, Marseille's fédérés, so their kind of volunteer National Guard units, played a key role on the 10th of August 1792, when the king was overthrown. And so Marseille as a city very much views itself psychologically as one of the key, I suppose, bringers of the French Republic. This city has previously demonstrated its ability to make a huge impact in events in Paris. And so it's reasonable for Marseille to think that they could do it again. And so what they do is, just like last time, they assemble a group of volunteers and they head north. And in this instance, they're heading towards Lyon. As you say, Rob, they make it to Avignon. Avignon essentially falls under their jurisdiction. But the problem is that between Lyon and Avignon is an offshoot of the Army of the Alps. And it's actually under Carteau, the famous painter turned officer that we see at the Siege of Toulon. And the problem with Marseille, like all these rebel strongholds, is that they haven't been able to acquire a very large force, and Carteau actually has a reasonable amount of troops comparatively under his command, and resistance in Avignon essentially dissipates. And slowly but surely, Carteau marches towards Marseille, and ultimately in late August, Marseille falls to Carteau and the convention. And it's the immediate arrival of Carteau and his soon to be arrival in Toulon, which is only 30 miles to the east of Marseille, that helps convince the residents of Toulon that they should make a deal with the British and essentially hand over the French Mediterranean fleet and the port. So that gives you a sense there of some of the difficulties that they faced, their insufficient ability to build military power and exert it farther away than their immediate proximity.
Thank you for that. Well, thank you, Will, for that. That was brilliant. It's been a fascinating conversation so far, and I'm about to end our recording. But please stay online as we continue to chat. To wrap up this month's Rally Point, thank you, William Clark, for joining us. That was excellent. Thank you, William.
Thank you.
For those of you who have joined us live this evening, thank you for your time as well. Next time, why not join us here at the Rally Point next month when we're going to be catching up with Napoleonic artist Keith Rockham. Simply contact Dominic or I for your Zoom invite, the details at the end of the video, and share Rally Point with your friends so we can hear from them as well. Now, any previous Rally Point chats are up on our YouTube channel, and if you've enjoyed this Rally Point, please leave a quick review. And so it's good morning from me, and if Dominic was with us, it would be good night from him. Good night.